Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Today, we are honored and privileged to introduce highly esteemed astrologer, author, and lecturer, Dr. Lehman. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
Well, since I'm in Portugal right now, I'm doing quite well.
Wonderful, nice and sunny.
Very nice and sunny.
Wonderful. So I'd love to start this interview by starting with your background. So can you tell us where you began with your astrological studies and what that environment was like as you began to seriously study astrology?
Well, there's always a question in our societies because astrology is not exactly an accepted form of knowledge about even how you get exposed to it. And I think for most of us, it at least has the appearance at the time of a random thing. My random thing was that when I was 9 years old, fourth grade, our teacher passed around bookmarks that of your sun sign. And so she went around the room and asked everybody when they were born and matched up the numbers and everything. And I got a nice little bookmark that said Virgo. And then, of course, it attempted to explain that. And, it seemed okay to me, but it was like, okay, all right, I'm a Virgo. But that's not the sort of thing that sticks. My experience came in 1976, when at the time I was in graduate school at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I was working on the first New York Regional Lesbian Feminist Conference. And New Jersey, New York, it's about an hour away. We'd have meetings Sunday night, they'd run late. I wouldn't be able to catch a bus back to New Brunswick, so I'd crash up at Columbia University in that area. And I stayed with a group who were going to Barnard College at the time. And one of them had a roommate who was into astrology. And she had the old Llewellyn volume that was about this large and that thick. And you could look up any planetary position. And of course, this was pure cookbook stuff. And so Louise had asked me, okay, what day were you born? She looked that up. She looked at the planetary positions. She starts reading the cookbook things. And then she says, but, I could say a lot more about this, except that I don't like to do the actual chart computation. Well, I was a graduate student in botany, sciences, math, no problem. I said, so what's the problem with the calculation? And she just said, I don't like it. And so, of course, that meant that a challenge had been thrown down. And so within a couple of weeks, I'd gotten all the books. As living near New York, you could get any book you wanted if you really wanted to search for it. So I got the books, started doing the calculations. I have to say my initial track record was not fantastic, but within a couple of weeks, I had found enough to be able to do a computation decently. And so then I had something which was great, which is I got the birth date on everybody that was on that organizing committee for this conference. And so then I made up a notebook, and the notebook had everybody by sun sign, everybody by moon sign, everybody by Mercury, and all the way down. And then if I had enough data to do ascendants and houses and everything, I filled them into that. And then I just sit through the meetings. And when I started getting bored with the content, I started flipping through and watching people doing whatever they were doing while going, why is that Venus and Gemini in the third house? And so that was my initial run into astrology.
And of course, you were doing this at a time, as Carol Tebb says, BC, so before computers.
Oh, absolutely.
Like my generation, we don't know we're born because we can type it in a computer and it pops up. So you're doing this all by hand as well at this time.
Yeah, I was doing it all by hand.
So also, what were your other sources of inspiration? So there was really your gateway. You started to develop and create your own chart. So were there any books at the time? I know you mentioned there was places that you could go. Were there any other sources of inspiration or any other authors at that time that you considered a part of your journey?
Well, what was relatively new at the time was Noel Till's 12-volume series on astrology. And that was another thing, because early in the series, he had to tell you how to calculate a chart. So his chart computation method was quite direct and simple. Probably his Capricorn appealed to my Virgo. And so first I could do that, and then he started going systematically through pieces. Now, later on, Noel and I would not exactly end up on the same page about interpretation of everything, but the point was, it was a solid series. There was a lot of information in it. There was stuff that you could hook onto, and that's when, because I had these example charts that I was working with immediately, I was at least as interested in what I was seeing in the charts as what I was seeing in any of the books that I was reading.
Fascinating. And before we get to your incredible body of work you've done over the decades, from your books to articles, researches, and the courses that you've produced, I would actually like to touch on a profound and important speech you gave, I think back in 2008 at KeplerCollege's commencement address. Now, you were talking here, I think the theme behind this was, is there a political dimension to being an astrologer? And you talked about the issues of discrimination and the parallels between the astrological community and the LGBTQ plus community. So would you like to make those key points again? Again, I thought it was such a profound speech that you gave that I would like to share with our audience.
You know, since I had come up through the I'm going to call it what we called it then, which was the gay and lesbian community, which just, serves to date me more than anything else. But it's also the native words that I spoke at the time. When you were coming up in that committee, I came out in my senior year of college. And it was at the time I was in Wisconsin. I was not at the University of Madison. I was at the satellite branch in Green Bay. This was not a profoundly popular choice. To give you an idea, when I got to Rutgers, within the first week I was there, I found the student gay group, joined it. And the big issue, one of the big issues at the time, was that the American Psychological Association had homosexuality as listed as a form of mental illness. And it was years before that came off their diagnostic list. So we were in a completely different situation. But later on, when I was, one of the things that bothered me was in the gay, in the gay community, you had a history of how people went through and dealt with that and eventually have moved on from that. Because what I'm very proud of in terms of my own movement work with that is that working in that community in the 70s and the 80s, I have a profound sense that we made a difference. And when you can look at that, when you can look at the fact that when I was active in that period of time, the idea that gay marriage would ever happen in my lifetime was just beyond even contemplating. I mean, you just didn't. You were dealing with much more fundamental issues of discrimination. Now, fast forward, we're now in the astrological community, and I'm sitting there as dean at Kepler, and I'm talking to a student in about 2000, maybe 4 or 5, who came to the school, and like so many of the people, because back in those days, as Carol has told you, Carol Tabbs, that we would come together as a college once every term, so 3 times a year, for a roughly 5 or 6 day symposium. And so this student had come to her first symposium, and she was like many of the students the first time. It's like her eyes are completely wide open. She then proceeds to get maybe 3 hours of sleep a night because she's up in the student lounge with all the other students talking through all their issues. And just for her and for so many of these people, talking astrology was a completely profound act that they had not been able to do, to have astrologer friends and astrology student friends, to actually be able to spend hours talking astrology, whether formally in a classroom or informally with a group, was just phenomenal.
That excitement of being in a group of people speaking the same language.
Right, exactly. And but then the thing was that what she realized is she could never come back. And the reason she could never come back was because her family would never accept it. And so there was this profound sorrow and shame. And in watching what this woman was going through, I saw exactly what I had seen so many people I knew in the gay community. I was fortunate to have parents who maybe were a bit begrudging at first in accepting me, but did not, but it was simply because they convinced themselves I'd grow out of it. But they didn't hassle me while I was in it. You know, and then eventually they realized, no, she's not growing out of it. But to watch this kind of discrimination against this woman in astrology, it was the same thing I had seen those many years ago. And that's when I started to put that lecture together. Because what astrology shared with homosexuality, now the longer version of it through queer, is that you can hide that, at least for moments. You can get on an airplane, and when somebody says, what do you do for a living? You can say, oh, I'm a consultant, instead of I'm an astrologer. And if you're not a professional at it, you don't have to say anything at all. And that was the same space that everybody in the gay community had, which is that all you had to do was not talk about it. And people might suspect, but it was amazing how many times people didn't suspect. So I think what that was is at the point that I gave that talk at Kepler, it was not the first time I talked about this, but it was the better time I talked about it, because it was the Kepler group was a lot more receptive to the idea than the ESAR conference that I had done it at maybe a year or two before that. But the idea is still the same, that if you, and in a sense, you know, when I said gays before Stonewall, I was very serious, because when you saw what was barely even called the gay community, because, you know, people were using homosexual, lesbian more, they were using, you know, they were even using some of the terms like invert, that now are absolutely antiquated. But what you saw then was people who had carved out this tiny little niche, you know, the gay bars, the lesbian bars, where they could go and socialize for an evening. But then they had to go back into the straight world. And I was seeing the same thing with so many of our Kepler students and so many of the people. It wasn't just Kepler, it was everybody in the astrological community, because this is how being in a society that doesn't accept you warps your mind. I mean, with racial issues, for example, you can't hide what you are. You know, so there's a history of lighter skinned blacks trying to pass at various points in time. But basically, you can't hide what you are. It's when you can also develop a level of shame and loathing that's very destructive. So that's why I gave that talk.
And again, it was very powerful, and I'm glad, and thank you for sharing with us again that today. And I guess that was even compounded by the fact that at that time there was no internet. So now, of course, you can be anywhere in the world and connect with other like-minded people or communities. This is what's so great about Kepler. Doesn't matter where, if you're in the middle of the Midwest in a small rural town, wherever that may. I guess that it sounded like, again, more compounded by the fact it was based on your location, and you didn't have the internet or the connection with others to have that. So I guess that was even more of a difficult time in that sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, from the point where Kepler was formed, and when we had our first symposium in 2000, we had the internet. What we didn't have is the richness of apps that people have now. But there was a lot of that community. It's still easier, I think, for people to build community personally, but we've all gotten used to Zoom. And I have plenty of friends that, well, for example, when's the last time I saw Carol? Carol and I worked together for how many years? And if you listen to her talk, you'll know it goes back before Kepler. But I haven't actually seen her physically since 2018. So that's 5 years ago. And yet, and this is the thing with the internet and with Zoom and everything else is I can still absolutely consider her a friend, even a close friend.
Absolutely. Yeah. I tend to agree. I think it's a good substitute. I mean, we can connect from, but I still believe in that physical proximity to other people. I think there's just a different magic there, I think, as well. So very, very interesting. So I'd like to touch on, again, your incredible body of work and some of the books that you have produced over the years, and not really in a chronological order, but I'd like to touch upon your book, which are Essential Dignities and the Book of Rulerships. And really the reasoning, what made you decide to write about those topics? And I believe the Essential Dignities book was the only book about essential dignities for a long time, I think, if I'm correct.
That's true. What happened, what you didn't mention is my kind of stepchild at this point, which is the Ultimate Asteroid Book, which is a stepchild because I wrote on asteroids and then I stopped using them, which is kind of
sorry, I know that was the first one. I wasn't going chronological.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. It was one of those funny things where when I didn't name it the Ultimate Asteroid Book, my publisher did. They thought it would sell better. And I remember saying to my partner Maggie, call something ultimate and it sounds like you're done with it. Like you've said everything you could possibly say. Well, yes. But what happened was at that point, back then in the 80s, I felt like I needed to do something else because I had been at that point doing lectures on asteroids for so many years that I was like asteroids in the blank. And I was just kind of done with it. So we sat down and talked and I was like, okay, what topic doesn't have too much of a density of speakers? And it was that literal because I was still relatively new on the speaker circuit. And if you looked at things systematically about how conferences were constructed, the people who were kind of like the senior people were the ones who were giving the talks on progressions and directions and solar returns and the natal chart in general. And it was like, and that was what I had done with the asteroids is if you did something that was a little bit off the beaten track, you had a better chance of being able to get a speaking engagement because they're not going to take you as the 15th person who could give a talk on secondary progressions. So we looked around and said, what isn't anybody doing? And the only thing that there was at that time that touched on the topic was Alan Oken had a book called Rulers of the Horoscope, I believe it was called, and which of course was not classical. I hadn't even thought about that yet. But I thought, rulerships, nobody's doing anything on rulerships. So I started with Alan's system of working with the dispositor rings. And so I worked with that a little bit, but I realized at that stage that I wasn't getting anything out of it. I mean, it was, yes, looking at dispositors or something, but it was like if somebody had something disposed by something else, which was disposed by something else, which was disposed by the first planet. Yeah, that and $2 at the time would get you a cup of coffee. So it wasn't singing. Well, it was around that time that we were looking at this and we were kind of puzzled, and I was actually working at that point on the production on the Asteroid Book. And we happened to go, by that stage, we were living in San Francisco and happened to go to the bookstore in San Francisco, Fields. I don't know whether it's still there or not. I hope it is, or that some iteration of it is still there. But anyway, Fields was featuring a new book. And the new book was William Lilly's Christian Astrology. And well, that was different. And not only was it different, it was huge, it was hardback, it was expensive. Perfect Christmas present. So I gave Maggie a copy of it for Christmas. And in the back of the book, there was a little flyer for Olivia Barclay's qualifying Horary diploma course. And Maggie said, geez, you know, I think I'd like to take that course. And I said, great, you take it. But in the meantime, we both got into reading it. And fairly early in the book is a description of essential Dignities. And I had never run into, until that point, anything other than, of course, the domicile and exaltation and a detriment and fall. So the idea that there were 3 more of them. So I was kind of intrigued. And so we started to look through this material. And with having Lily there, it was, wow, this isn't the same way anything's happening anymore. And so we started studying the material. She did sign up for Olivia's course. I thought, Horary, who wants to do Horary? But I was looking at it more from a natal standpoint. But we were absolutely intrigued by what we were reading. And so then Maggie sent off her first lesson to Olivia. And in that first lesson, one of the questions that Olivia asked the students was, what rules the Lime tree? What planet rules the Lime tree? And so anyway, Maggie grew up in Florida. Lime means green fruit, sour. And so now, of course, think sour fruit. Is this Mars because it's sour? Or is it Venus because it's green? Okay, so that was kind of a conundrum. And so Maggie's thinking sour. It's, you know, the acidity of a citrus fruit is so obvious. So she sends this answer off to Olivia. And 2 weeks later, and I say 2 weeks because this part was before the internet, because this is when a correspondence course really was by mail. And we were in San Francisco, Olivia was in England. So back comes the mail with Olivia making some really saggy comment about, well, everyone knows that the lime tree has branches like forked lightning. It has to be Jupiter. And so I have a PhD in botany. So I'm going, really? Really? And I looked at Maggie and said, I'm not sure I believe that. How are we going to figure this out? And so we thought about it and said, let's go to the bookstore. The solution to everything. They had an illustrated copy of Culpeper's Herbal, which we got, which fortunately from my standpoint had the modern botanical nomenclature for the plants that Culpeper mentioned. And since what I was doing vocationally at the time was working as a database programmer, I set up a database. And my database was name of plant, common name of plant, branching pattern, and planetary rulership. And so I went through the entire book of Culpeper, did all the classification.
Wow.
And then in the meantime, as I'm reading Culpeper, what I'm discovering is in his text, what he's talking about is the medical properties of the plant. And so he talked about this plant as being related to, you know, this kind of illness, and you treat that, and so forth. And so it's obvious to me that what Culpeper was saying was that the rulership is related to the diseases that it treats. So, but what about that branches like fork and lightning thing? Well, so being a database, you can sort it any way you want. No relationship of rulership and branching pattern. It was definitely the medical. And then I actually did a little extra work to establish what percentage of the medical items actually match the rulership. Well, by the time I was done with it, I had a stack of papers like this. I sent it to Olivia and said, what you said is wrong. And by the way, never ask an American about the lime tree and think you're going to get Telia, the linden tree, because you're going to get the citrus lime. And that was my other observation as a botanist. So by this stage, of course, I'm completely hooked.
Mm-hmm.
So Essential Dignities came out of that. And by this stage, I was studying the Horary as much as Maggie was.
I have to say, I love your dedication and just the lengths that you'll go to dive into a question or a point. That's quite remarkable.
Well, this is how this is how you learn. And yes, I was pissed off at the fact that Olivia was being very, being very casual about, well, everyone knows. I think the thing is, this is how you learn. Look at how many of us, you see an article in whatever publication you're looking at or whatever website, and so has just had a car accident. And what do? You're running to the Astro data bank and you say, have I got a time on this person? And that's how you learn. It's whatever method you're looking at, taking the time to actually work it. That's how you learn.
So I would ask this as well, going back to Essential Dignities, going back to rulerships. Why do you think it's important for students of astrology to study the Essential Dignities and the other topics we're talking about?
If you look historically, and I think this is the thing, when you study astrology within its classical or historical context, what you discover is that the philosophy and logic of astrology was absolutely as profound as the logic and philosophy for any other field of learning. And so astrologers always, in this earlier period, were directly involved in the whole process of inquiry into the way that things are, and not just astrologically, but everything. You find astrology imbued with the entire system of knowledge for centuries. Now, why would we want to give that up? Within that system, what the Essential Dignities and, of course, the accidental dignities and fortitudes also told you was, what is the strength of the planet? Modern astrology works primarily with what's the relationship of one planet to another, which we call the aspects. And whether you're talking about the typical aspects or whether you're talking about something like midpoint trees, either way, you're talking about relationship of planets to each other. Great, fine, wonderful information. But what's also important to know is that in this particular chart, Venus doesn't kick, but Saturn does. And that's not just a phenomenon of the relationships it has with other people or with other planets, but how much power it feels. One of the ways that I have tried to explain this is, for example, when you're watching kids and you're watching kids learn, there are some things that come easy. There's some kids that can be out on the playground or in a gym class, and you tell them to do this, and they're doing it before you finish telling them what to do. And there are other kids that are practically tripping over themselves. And this is not to say that one is smart and one is dumb, although, you could call this a kind of physical intelligence if you wanted to. It's the same thing in terms of how the mind works and when you're teaching kids to do something. There are kids who can learn languages in a flash. There are other kids who are stumbling over their words. They have speech impediments, or they have something which slows them down, or from a muscular standpoint, they don't have the muscles when they try to go into another language to speak it well. Or they have a hearing problem and they can't hear the difference between two similar sounds. This issue of talent, this kind of very narrow kind of talent, is something that those are analogies for what the dignities can do for you. If you have a dignified Venus, then you don't have to think about doing Venusian things because you're already there and you're doing them. And furthermore, you rely on it. You have confidence in it. But now consider that you're in a math class for third graders and you're doing a speed test. And who's going to do better on the speed test? Somebody with Mercury in Taurus or somebody with Mercury in Gemini? And so now what happens? The kid with Mercury in Taurus basically is going to get the message, I'm dumb. The kid with Mercury in Gemini is going to get the message, I'm either smart or I'm good or something like that. And and now this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But is the Mercury and Gemini kid necessarily smarter than the Mercury and Taurus kid? No. But you give that particular kind of test, and the Mercury and Gemini kid looks smarter. And so now you've got a whole series of consequences that starts from that tendency of our society to want people to do things quickly rather than well.
So we've touched on the essential dignities, your Book of Rulerships. Now you are a renowned expert in Horary, Electional and Medical Astrology. So I'd like to touch on your book on Horary astrology. And I believe it's not a subject or a branch that you were particularly enamored with. Is that correct initially? And then
initially, no, I thought, what do people want to do this for? But it's something that grows on you. So now it's one of my passions, and it was William Lilly's book, which is what completely opened my mind about it.
Wonderful, wonderful. And talking about, again, what was your reasoning, as we talked about, for your essential dignities and Book of Rulerships, as you started to write your let's see, again, it was called The Martial Art of Horary Astrology. I love that title. So can you explain a bit about why that title, martial art? Is that the dance you do and the art and the technique?
No, it's the fact that I was studying Taekwondo at the time.
Okay.
And the cover is my round kick. But again, it was, you asked about what got me doing that lecture about the analogy between astrologers and gays before Stonewall. It's the same thing with horary and martial art. What I was perceiving, why horary has been such a profound experience, I think, for many modern astrologers in learning it, is that the typical modern astrology has focused on the idea of self-understanding. Now, very worthy topic, but not so much what astrologers in the past were emphasizing. Because when you lived in a time period which was harder, just plain out harder than our modern period. You look at things, looking historically, you're looking at things like life expectancy curves were positively depressing. Okay, people were doing hard physical labor their whole lives. A harvest could ruin you. So in that kind of world, people had real life and death questions that they were asking. You take the kind of classic royal conundrum, because who could afford to hire astrologers? Who were the high-paid astrologers of any era before ours? It was the royal astrologers. Okay, so what, you're Henry VIII. Okay, I don't know whether he used an astrologer or not, but his daughter did.
You better be accurate or be off with your head.
But you know, the thing is, here he is, and he can't have kids. And the two older kids he has, they're daughters, which you know, in Tudor England, you know, Henry's the son of an upstart. Henry VII, you know, was a new line, fledgling line. What have you know, what's the biggest job of the king? To procreate and have another king. You know, and if you can't do that, you know, forget it. You failed. So you're looking at, because of issues like they had the same diseases we have, but they didn't have some of the understanding of how things worked. There were all the issues with, you know, what we now call environmental poisoning. There were all sorts of things that they didn't know about sanitation and hygiene and everything else. So the odds of making it through childhood were actually rather low. So granted, they didn't have contraception either, but how many sons did you have to have one who would actually get old enough to come to the throne and procreate in his own right? So that meant that every time that a royal son is born, Dad's first question is this kid going to even make it to adulthood? Now, you're a modern astrologer. Do you even have the tools to answer that question? But those tools are in the traditional astrology. And basically the tools were used for these kind of purposes with a much more survival based idea, which I would argue now, as things are getting a little rougher in our current environment, is probably a good thing to come back to.
Absolutely.
But it's a different philosophy to what you're doing with the system. Essential dignities were part of that, because you had to be honest. You had to say, you know, here's the chart of son number one, here's the chart of son number two, here's the chart of son number three. When in your society, out of those three sons, one or two of them statistically will be dead by 14. Which one is the one that lives?
And it's very harsh and pointed language. So do you think part of the issue with some modern astrologers who barked at the more deterministic ancient text, which very pointed language, and of course it's not very flowery, but of course you're putting it in a context where people, you know, the mortality rate was very, very high, and being able to survive was such a big key, you know, not living in a modern world where you've got all, you know, this medical advancements where people are living longer. So I think obviously that the text and the ancient text was a lot more pointed and a lot more to the point, because they didn't have time, I don't think, for the flowery language or the.
Oh, listen, they could get real flowery when they were arguing with each other.
Oh, I guess, yeah.
So never underestimate that. But I think the thing is, the purpose of what you were doing was different. And you know, there's not all of traditional astrology is hard-edged. It really isn't, because you look, for example, Lily is such a wonderful text because he gives so many examples. And you know, he's giving the same examples of love life problems that anybody now is talking about. So, you know, people and their emotions were the same. But some of what you wanted an astrologer for were different. In a world where things are a bit more survivalist, you know, you're going to be spending less time on self-understanding than you are on planning for the future.
Right. And of course, right now, as you said before, coming back to this, what now we've got here with the climate emergency. I mean, I'm not sure if humanity will be here in the next 100 years, but I guess we'll have to see. So fingers, if we pull our finger out and do something about the current crises that are going on right now, very much applies. So I'd also like to talk about your book, The Traditional and Medical Astrology. And I will have to say, if anyone watching would like to see, go to your YouTube channel. There's an excellent video you did on the medical astrology of Karen Carpenter, which was very fascinating. I don't know if you still upload videos or you still go on with that channel. So again, what was going into medical astrology? What drew you to that branch of astrology?
Well, I actually was drawn to it fairly early because since my academic background is botany, of course, the history of plants as far as being involved in therapeutics. I mean, in all societies have used plants as therapy. So I was already kind of pre-wired to the topic. And of course, that whole experience with Olivia, when I sent her the stack of paperwork, is, you could argue was the start of my interest in medical astrology. Once, there's a huge piece of medical astrology is horary. Now, again, a lot of the people who got into medical astrology more in a modern context don't necessarily see that. But the ancient material, the horary is a huge thing. And so that's an interest. It's also, a lot of it is client driven. I mean, it's not that you don't get other topics. I tend to not get too many other topics because I'm known in the community as being a medical astrologer. But it comes up whether that's your specialty or not. I have several general astrologers who send all their medical clients to me because they just don't want to deal with those particular kinds of issues. But my interest basically did start with Culpeper, and I said, well, what else is there? And so, because ultimately, I very much ascribe to the kind of philosophy behind medicine that was typical in traditional Chinese, which is that, yes, your job as a physician is to treat your patient, but ultimately your job is to live a healthy lifestyle and to teach other people to live a healthy lifestyle. So you don't have to ask those questions about what they need to do now that they're sick. And it was that idea that you could live better through understanding your own medical astrology, which was one of the things that was driving me when I got into studying medical, which was not too much after I started studying horary in general. I mean, you can do a lot with medical astrology just reading the section in Lily on matters of the sixth house. It's not everything, but it's a really good start.
And I believe you talked about the difficulty in writing that particular book as the whole system of traditional medicine, or a lot of it was lost. Am I correct in thinking that you're making that point?
If you want to learn traditional medicine, and when I teach medical astrology, I prefer to teach traditional medicine alongside of it. If you want to learn that, you can, because the whole corpus of traditional medicine is still there. It's just several things happened. The biggest thing that happened was that in the Renaissance, a lot of ideas changed. In the medieval period, you had several really important works like Avicenna's in talking about the system of medicine. That system of medicine, which was based on the four humors, which astrologically we see as the four elements, didn't require a substantial amount of anatomical or physiological knowledge in the modern sense. Because first of all, in the quality of surgery in Middle Ages had declined markedly since the period of the Hellenistic period and the Roman period. Surgeons then, probably because of the number of battles and everything that was current at the time, were very good, and we know what their tools were. They had much better tools, surgical tools, in that period than were in the Middle Ages. So, but that doesn't mean there was nothing they could do. Avicenna talked about different kinds of baths, for example, that were many of which were herbal. There were other systems that they could work with. But most of this was, again, about this idea that if you can put the body into balance, it will tend not to get sick in the first place. So we can learn those techniques. And that's one thing that I teach, because if you try to do the astrology without the system that it was embedded in, it doesn't make nearly as much sense. So So actually, when you look at traditional medical astrology, you'll see whole chapters in there where there's astrology, yes, but it's coming out of things like Hippocrates.
So I'd like to switch gears here and talk about KeplerCollege. And so I'd like to start of how you got involved within KeplerCollege and back in the early days and where you are today. So how did that come about? How did you get involved with KeplerCollege and the curriculum in the early days?
Before KeplerCollege opened, the way that it works as far as setting up a college or setting up a college at that time, because Kepler ended up kind of pushing the envelope as far as the state of Washington was concerned ultimately. But what you had was a board of trustees that was set up first. And it was the board's job to put together the initial program that would be taught, to put together the funding mechanism, to put together the administrative system, in other words, to put everything together. And then it was understood that once you got an administration, once you got a faculty, the administration would take over administration, faculty would take over teaching, and the board would supervise the whole thing. But in the beginning, the board did the whole thing. So the board had to learn what the state of Washington would allow in order to have a college. And the first thing that the board realized was that there's a whole lot that you've got to teach, which wouldn't be the subject of astrology. So what had to be embedded within this school that was going to give bachelor's degrees in astrology was history, writing, math, philosophy, any of these other areas that now are generally called in the United States general studies. But all that had to be embedded in this. And it couldn't just be an occasional mention. So I was not involved at all in this phase. What the board was doing was figuring out, okay, we've got to have liberal, if we're going to be a liberal arts college, which is what the decision was, that we've got to have liberal arts credits. So they hit on the idea that the entire first year would be history with writing, because there are formulas, for example, for how much reading you should have to do within the course of a week, how much writing you should have to do. So they had all the formulas, and they had this general thing about, we're going to teach a year of history, but it's going to be history focusing on astrology, but not limited, because just teaching the history of astrology would not fly. So as they put together this curriculum, they realized that they needed to have a faculty that could teach this curriculum. And part of that issue was, according to the standards, there had to be both MAs and PhDs. Now, at that time, PhDs were really, really thin on the ground in astrology. And so the two people who then became the three people who are going to be most involved in this curriculum during the first year were Rob Hand and Nick Campion and Demetra George. Rob only had a bachelor's degree, so he was only allowed to teach one term. Nick had his master's degree, and Demetra either had it or was just getting it. I forget that first term. And I wasn't part of the original plan. But what they realized is they needed a PhD. And now my degree is not in any of those fields. But they could justify me because, interestingly, when I got my degree, it wasn't a Doctor of Science, it was a PhD. And there's this thing about PhDs having a little more broad spectrum. And because I was already publishing in the area of classical astrology, so I had a historical component that could be justified. So that was how I got involved at the faculty level. That was back in 2000. I did not teach in the first symposium, but I was there because I was the guest speaker that kind of put together more of an overview of how the program could look. I started teaching in the second term, and I continued to teach in the third term. So we got through that first year, what was interesting was the way that the Board of Trustees expected things to go is they looked at this first year of, okay, obeisance to the liberal arts requirements. Everybody will get to learn some of the history of astrology, which will be great. They'll tolerate the other history because they have to. We'll throw some math in because we have to. They'll write on topics where they can do something that's more historically based on astrology, but it's still astrology. And then they'll get to do astrology in the second year. What happened was that entire first group of students went crazy and loved that year of history. So then the next year we had to put together a program of how were we going to teach astrology at an academic level. And so we brought in a couple of new instructors, but this idea, Kepler had this interesting idea of these guest lectures. I don't know whose original idea that was. Enid Newberg was president of the college at the time. It may have been her idea, but I don't know. But anyway, one of the things that happened with the guest lecture thing is people tended to be brought in as a guest lecturer a term or two before they were going to teach. And it was almost like a tryout. So in that first term of the second year, we brought in a presumptive teacher, Ph.D. in psychology. He bombed as a guest lecturer. He absolutely totally bombed. And the reason that he bombed was because he didn't know the history. And after the students had had a year of history, and then this guy was coming in making all these wild statements about, oh, you know, everybody just in the Middle Ages is like burning witches or whatever. And it was
they were like, hold on a minute, we know the history, we've been learning.
Right. And that's what happened. That the Kepler student body was very interactive at that time with the faculty and with the administration. And so this guy gave this lecture. He gave these platitudes about history, which were just completely ignored. And the students grabbed Enid and grabbed the faculty and said, you want us to learn from this guy? You're crazy. And so suddenly, in this first term of the astrology section, the faculty and administration was put in a position to have to completely rethink what the curriculum of Kepler was going to be. And another piece that came into play that had started to come into play actually in the end of that first year was that the person at the higher education board in Washington State, who was in charge of it at the time, had his master's degree in psychology. And he started pointing out to Enid that if you were going to call something psychology, that because the American Psychological Association was so involved with the curriculum, you had to meet all these requirements. So everybody would have to take a course in developmental astrology or psychology. And there was about 6 or 7 psychology courses that would have to be given with very little leeway to be able to put the word astrology even into them.
Wow.
So suddenly, again, this idea of we're going to teach psychological astrology got stopped by what was needed to get a bachelor's degree.
Wow. So that discrimination against astrology was still very much strong at that time. And again, going back to your 2008 speech, you talk about the importance of free inquiry and freedom of speech. So again, it seems like all this experience with Kepler, you're still struggling against that discrimination at that time.
Well, I don't totally blame the higher education board, because the thing was, what they were talking about is, if you give an academic degree, and this, this is the same thing as when we talked in that first year of history about what a BA degree meant in the Middle Ages, that you could study at Oxford and get your BA and go to Poland and teach. And because you'd be teaching in Latin either way, everything was portable, and they knew what you would have studied. If you're going to use the word BA in psychology, it had that same level of portability. And so you could, so there was a level of restriction about, well, you're trying to call it psychological astrology, but where's the psychology? Okay. And this was always an issue at Kepler, that sometimes there were words like psychology that had a strong pre-existing, let's call it professional focus, that you couldn't really tread on. Now, when Carol Tabbs later on was developing literature at Kepler, well, when you're teaching literature, you can teach the literature of anything, just label it. But there isn't that same kind of sense of, this is an area you can't tread on. It's, you want to spend the entire term talking about astrological themes in Dante. Well, if you can pick them out and you can do it in an appropriate way with literature, and if you write long enough papers on it, and you use critical thinking in the process, go for it. But there are other places where you couldn't do that. So that was the kind of challenge that Kepler had at that time. Now, it was in that period around the second year where Enid had to acquire an academic dean. But at the academic dean position, unlike the president's position, had to have a Ph.D. What ended up happening was, in the initial period of time, is we had co-deans, because, as we call them, spelled a little differently than the common word that sounds like that. But Dennis Harness and I became, initially he was the dean and I was the associate dean, and then we got the same title after a year. And so we were the ones who were in charge of the curriculum. And so what happened at that stage was, I was working with the faculty to produce a kind of a degree that would have the academic rigor that we needed to have as a degree granting college, that would also have enough astrology to be satisfying to our audience. And I think we were very successful in coming up with that program. But there were moments of teeth gnashing.
I bet at that time. And of course, all of you fantastic people have produced some fabulous graduates over the years as well. So let's talk about your future with Kepler. I think we're okay to talk about now. So what future plans have we got in terms of Kepler College and yourself?
Well, the first thing is, starting in the term this coming fall, I will be teaching Horary at Kepler for the first time in probably about 8 or 9 years.
Wow, wonderful.
It's not the first time, in my vocabulary, which is probably not everybody else's vocabulary, but I talk about academic and vocational Kepler, just because in my mind, it's, there is a divide there, a divide, but hopefully not a chasm. I have taught Horary in the vocational stage. It's just been a while. So I'm happy to be back doing that. And then probably starting in 2024, we're looking to be developing a medical program at Kepler that, and my interest in doing this is that, some of you people may know that I've been teaching a medical program through the School of Traditional Astrology. What is being talked about at Kepler is something very different than that, but I'm the overlap player. What is different about the Kepler program, and that I'm very enthusiastic about, is that first of all, it's a multidisciplinary approach. Now, this is something that what almost everything in the original academic Kepler was people teaching together, and often in a multidisciplinary way, such as I taught with Dennis Hardis for a number of years. I taught with Gary Gomes for a number of years, where I would be teaching things like Horary, Electional, and Medical with Western methods, and Dennis or Gary would be teaching the same things with Eastern methods. So we had the for the students, this was just fantastic, because you could take the same Horary question and look at it using Western astrology or using Jyotish, and the students got some real insights into this. Kepler in those days taught as three streams very deliberately and very separately. Traditional Western astrology, modern Western astrology, and Indian astrology. And it was an incredible experience developing that curriculum, because what ended up happening was our students came out conversant in those three languages. And what they realized, and this is the power of working in this kind of multi-dimensional way, is that they got way better results keeping the streams separate, because you could look at a horary, and this is what happened, because Dennis and I, for example, when we first developed this, he had mainly some electionals, and we worked with his electional ones, and we worked with my horary ones, because that's just how our practices broke out a little better. But I would give a horary question and look at it and show how you would work it from a traditional Western way. He would then take the same one, put it into a Jyotish chart. We both got the same results. But there were little details that you picked up in the traditional Western that you did not pick up in the Jyotish, and vice versa. So in the end, you got the confirmation in case you were worried that you didn't have the right answer. And then you got additional details, which made it worth doing both ways.
Wow.
Now, after I had that experience working with Dennis, I happened to have mentioned this to the modern astrologer, Karen Hamaker-Zonda. And we did some work where we put together a couple of lectures where we swapped horaries. Now, Karen had written a book a number of years ago on horary astrology. It was based on the methods of Ivy Goldstein Jacobson. I would do a horary and get and get this result. She would do a horary. We both get the same basic answer, but again, differences in detail. And this is, I think, a very important thing about working this way.
And that's, again, such an exciting approach where students can come in and pull all that together. And for me, one of the advantages of coming through Kepler on a different note was coming in, and it's not just the depth, but we've got the breadth as well.
Exactly.
So it's not just a shove into one area. You explore the options and see where you want it to go.
Right. So now this is the kind of model that we're putting into this medical program that we're developing at Kepler. And what I see here is the program that I've been teaching for the last few years at STA, the medical program. First of all, it's only traditional, because that's what the STA is.
Right.
So it's not like, oh, it's only traditional. It's just, that's what I teach, and that's what my expertise is.
Right.
What those students are getting is a program where they're building on having already learned traditional horary. Then they're going to work medical within that system. And so it's a clear program running in one historical social context. So those students can come out of this, with some very powerful techniques.
Mm.
What I see happening with Kepler is, yes, there's going to be a robust traditional system within it, but there's also going to be, we're also looking to create this program so that there will be modern astrology. There may be even more than that, as far as by the time everything's done. I mean, the program hasn't been outlined in terms of exactly what the courses or exactly what the instructors are going to be. But I think that teaching within the context of knowing these periods is extremely important. And one of the reasons I love getting back to Kepler on this is, first of all, I love this way of teaching in general, but also the students understand this. One of the things that I can run into as a very frustrating thing in STA from time to time is the students who come into STA, whether you're talking about at the Horary level or at the medical level, are people who, they started with modern astrology too. Like almost everybody now starts at least at some amount on a modern level, but they don't always get the lesson that you've got to keep the different systems in separate tracks.
Right.
But they try to meld them. So, for example, on a medical level, if you're trying to do traditional medical astrology, but you're using Cornell as a source, Cornell is too late. And so by the time of Cornell, you'd had the beginning of the breakdown of this traditional medical system, this Hippocratic system, which is what had driven the astrology in the first place. And I think this is the thing, that when you get in the 20th century, if you're going to tie your medical astrology to modern medicine, you better have some pretty hefty training in that modern medicine approach, which most of us as lay people don't have. Now, if you have training as a naturopath, if you have training as a nurse, if you have higher training as far as being able to really understand the modern levels, that's a different thing. But the think is different. And it's that issue of think, which is what really, when you're doing it consciously and you're working with it, can produce some absolutely fantastic results in the end.
Absolutely, and that's going to be very exciting for the future of Kepler. I'm sure those classes will fill up fast. Now, I've heard you talk about before, let's go talk about students, the importance of critical thinking. Now, would you like to share some of your thoughts on that when you're teaching students, the importance again of critical thinking when studying, on answering questions?
Because I spent all those years as dean of Kepler, I have these buzzwords down, and critical thinking is an academic buzzword, and it's one that I'll fight under that ban. Because what do you mean by critical thinking? Again, astrology for centuries was taught as part of a system of philosophy and inquiry about how to understand the world. This isn't just what did we invent yesterday. This is stuff where there was supposed to be a logic behind it. And the critical thinking is something like, okay, taken a modern context. If you're interested in looking at Plutoids, okay, which a number of astrologers are interested in looking at the Kuiper Belt objects. Pick which words you want to use. Whether
sorry, can you just repeat that? Can you just repeat that again? That the audio clipped out. Can you just start that?
Okay,
that bit
sure,
again?
Sure. If you want to talk about Kuiper Belt objects, okay, and whether you want to talk about KBOs or whether you want to say Plutinos or Plutoids or whatever word you want to use. What is your philosophy for how they work? Now, this is actually the same question I had to ask myself when I was writing the Ultimate Asteroid Book. And you see all these things come around if you go far enough. Sooner or later, you come back on it. But is an asteroid the same thing as a planet? Now, I'm not talking astronomically, because if it's astronomical, then that's outside of our field. We have to use the astronomical definitions. But is it the same thing? And part of the logic of looking at this is that whether you say that there are 7 planet lights in the traditional fashion, or whether you say 10, or whether you say around 10, for depending on where those definitions fall, it's a relatively small number. You can get to know them quite well. And the odds that 200 years from now, there are going to be more planets that are being used is actually quite low. Although there will be undoubtedly more Kuiper Belt objects available to use. Now, if you have 30 Kuiper Belt objects, 50 Kuiper Belt objects, 100 Kuiper Belt objects, can you treat them the same as planets? The same as, can you treat 20,000 asteroids the same as planets?
Right.
Well, if you're honest, of course you cannot. But what is the distinction? And how do you do it differently? And are there some things that are the same and there's some things that are different? The thing is that when people started looking at asteroids, I remember Ellie Bach. Now, she wasn't the first person to do asteroids, because when the first asteroids were discovered back in the early part of the 19th century, the astrologers at the time thought this was really cool stuff. And so, of course, they were going to look at them. But there comes a point where astrologers knew, and because the astronomers knew, that at first there were 10 of them, then there were 100 of them, then there were 1,000 of them, then there were 10,000s of them. How big does it have to be an asteroid?
Right.
Where does it have to be an asteroid in the solar system? What's your underlying philosophy that allows you to draw meaning, and given that you're dealing with a much bigger symbol set? Now, I'm not saying there isn't an answer to this, but I'm very serious about the question of how can you do it, because our goal as astrologers always must be to provide clarification, to provide information, knowledge, insight that wasn't there before you had the symbolism to do it. And that requires an underlying, call it philosophy, or system structure within which to talk about this.
So even there, you're demonstrating the importance of critical thinking, in that you're going, okay, let's ask the important questions and let's go through and ask what's behind this, what's the meaning, if we're to provide clarification in what we're teaching.
That's exactly what the critical thinking does, because in the end, if you're being a prophet, there is no critical thinking. And prophecy is a perfectly valid form of human experience, but it's not one that you can study in the same context as a body of knowledge. And if it's a body of knowledge, then you need to have a way of parsing how the knowledge fits together, how you can extend the knowledge, what constitutes the grammar of a sentence that you can deliver. Now, we can come to different ideas based on the knowledge that we have. I mean, 30 years ago, you couldn't really talk about Plutinos as a class. You could only talk about Pluto. So more knowledge gives you the ability to have more sophisticated questions. but you still need to have a method of doing critical thinking to be able to kind of parse between the surface knowledge of this and the depth knowledge that we want, because it's the depth knowledge that we want to have to really be able to approach our astrology in a sophisticated way.
Absolutely. Brilliant point. And I would like now to move on to your thoughts on the issues of regulation in astrology, the importance of places like Kepler in terms of certification and that kind of body. And of course, in a field where we are not regulated, the importance of having a solid foundation for students to come and to learn. I know that there's a lot of questions within those questions, but I just wanted to get your thoughts and general thoughts around some of these topics in this field.
I spent a lot of time in my earlier years working with astrological organizations. I do not favor astrological organizations as certification bodies.
Okay.
And the reason that I don't is because two reasons. First of all, going back to my history in queer culture, that when you are on the periphery of acceptable behavior, why are you copying the white man's standards? And this is a real question for me, because a lot of the certification is to keep people out, not bring people in. If the certification is merely for the purpose of showing I have studied here, that's not really certification, that's lineage. You get a certification, you get a diploma from KeplerCollege, or you get a certification or a diploma from the School of Traditional Astrology. Either way, people in the astrological community have an idea of several things. One thing they have an idea of is that you worked your ass off. Okay. Another thing they have an idea of is generally that you studied with people that have a certain repute within the astrological community. So there can be an understanding of your lineage. My lineage, if I state my lineage, comes through Olivia Barclay. Now, even though she pissed me off all those years ago, even though I could sit there with a drink and talk to many other fellow survivors of Olivia Barclay, she still was my teacher. And she influences my thinking. Beyond Olivia is William Lilly. And that is my lineage, because what Olivia taught was primarily William Lilly, not exclusively, because Olivia herself had read, the Horary books that were extant before Lilly became extant. So, we all have lineages. The people who studied with me at KeplerCollege in the academic phase, their lineage is stated in the form of a BA degree, or an MA degree, or an AA degree. And it's not the Lee Lehman lineage per se. I was part of that, but it was a collective. But those lineages tell people much more about what you achieved and what you think and what you did. The certifications have largely been an exercise to try to mimic a professional credential process in the community. But all those ones that they're mimicking, number one, were designed to exclude people, and often did exactly that. But they were also designed, and this is another piece of it, around the fact that before you could do a certification, you had to have an academic institution that could give a degree in it. And so back when we were KeplerCollege academic, there was the whole question that we should have been the starting point to a certification process, not one where the organizations were deciding whether or not they could certify us. A lot of this process got started too early because so many astrologers wanted to create what they called professional astrology. And I understand the desire, because the desire came out of, how are you different as a serious studying astrologer from Madame Zelda down the street who tells fortunes? I get it. But if you want to have that level of distinction, first build the educational system that can give it to you.
Very, very interesting point. And let me ask you, and I know we've talked about this before, whether we survive in the next 50 or 100 years with the climate emergency and all the rest of the crises going on, but where do you see astrology in the next 40, 50, or 100 years from now? Any thoughts, or just doing the here and now?
I don't know. And I'll tell you why I don't know. I mean, the climate stuff or any other, I mean, all it takes is a few nuclear bombs and it's all academic. But there are decisions we in the astrological community have to take. For example, only a few people learn how to compute charts anymore. And, you know, much as I have no desire to go back to computing charts by hand, but the ability to know that you can, and have the tools to be able to do that, are huge. Now, there are a lot of astrology programs, especially on phones. So there are a lot of people who have learned how to at least do the math.
Right.
But you've got a serious legacy problem in terms of astrology programs, and more in terms of astrology background tools like Astrodienst. This was a boomer project. And so we need to have ways to make sure that the equations, the data, the computational capabilities survive between generations. Because to me, one of the biggest things about having those computers, besides ease, is that it allows all of us to do more techniques than we ever had time to do when you had to do it by hand. And so how much do we allow this transmission from generation to generation? Because the more separated you become from the math of astrology, the more you become like the city kid who doesn't know that milk comes from a cow.
Exactly. And that's why I appreciate KeplerCollege so much, having gone through myself and knowing now how to do calculations and charts by hand. At first I was terrified because, again, Mercury in Pisces, I'm not great with numbers. Mathematics is not my forte, but with Ian Newberg and doing the chart calculations by hand, not only was it important to know the mathematics and you could calculate charts by hand, but for me, I felt more intimate with the chart as well that I was creating, not just typing a few numbers in a computer and it generates like magic out of the sky. Actually doing things by hand gave me, again, a sense of intimacy with what I was doing. So that was another component as well. I think that's why it's important, places like KeplerCollege, in order to get your diploma, is to be able to calculate charts by hand.
Now, you know, you talk about this and it seems like this should be a slam dunk, but consider ACS, Astro Computing Services. Those of us who still have physical ephemerides, probably 90% of us have ACS. ACS died during COVID as a company. Who takes its place? So these are the things. There's a lot of these accidental possibilities to make things more difficult. Now, I believe astrology will, if humans survive, astrology will survive, as long as we have a certain level of literacy and mathematical skill. I do believe that. But there are these questions about how well it will survive. And also, we have to admit that a lot of what's going on our phones with astrology is not really helping astrology that much, because it's at such a superficial level that, you know, it's more fun than it is real.
Right.
So the ratio of that is another question in terms of how well astrology survives. If institutions like Kepler survive, then we will thrive as an astrological community. Right now, in you know, where most of my time over the last few years I've been spending within STA. STA was founded by Deborah Holding, who is 9 years younger than me. Good on her. We have generational shifts that need to keep happening. At STA, we've got Wade Caves, who is doing the bulk of the work now within the Horary class, and good on it. He's also introduced a course on astronomy that, like at Kepler, is teaching the students how to calculate by hand. This is another, you know, these are the things that have to keep developing. And we, you know, even when you start thinking about, well, you know, the school that I'm not teaching at that's teaching the same thing as my school is competitive. When you're thinking that way, you're thinking small. What we need to have is excellence in the entire astrological community, whatever school of astrology they're teaching, whatever methods they're teaching. And part of excellence to me is also developing these ideas of critical thinking, of how people can think astrologically in the most successful way. And how much of this can we transmit? That's really the question for me of the 20, 30, 40, 100 years is, yeah, if we're wiped out by climate change, well, then that's what happens. But our job is to keep teaching it, keep preserving it, keep asking questions. It really strikes me how much astrology has expanded in the near 50 years I've been doing it. And mostly I see that as a good process, because a lot of this is because all the people who have felt called to do astrology, whether now or 50 years ago, I have a whole lot more time to spend studying astrology than William Lilly did. And thinking of his life in that sense, you know, what he was able to accomplish with the lesser life expectancy of the 17th century, with the fact that so little was mechanized, the fact that he didn't have a computer, the fact that he did have to calculate by hand, the fact that he had to write out his notes longhand. All these things where we have labor-saving devices are incalculable as far as what that means that you can actually study. And so where will we be in 20 or 40 or 60 years? Well, it depends on also where our technologies will be.
Those are some really fascinating and incredible insights. And it makes me think myself, I mean, talking about not speaking for my own generation, but it makes me wonder, not putting parallels astrology with religion, but if you look at the Pew Research Center and our generations moving away from organized religions and these generational shifts, it makes me wonder if astrology now tapping into the zeitgeist and becoming more popular, whether it does hopefully thrive. Well, I guess we'll have to see. Last couple of questions here. I know we're coming to your time here. So one of the questions we've got is, what advice would you give for current students of astrology and budding astrologers out right now? What advice would you give them in your many decades of being a top astrologer?
The more charts you'll do, the better you get. That's number one. You know, I think that as I say, the computer or the phone, incalculable savings on scut work. You know, Just being but there's also the thing that I was taught in my science classes from the beginning. You need to look at the data. You always need to look at the data. And the more data you look at, the more potential you have for insights. And right now, it's a gift as far as how much time we can actually spend on the things that matter and the questions that matter, because we do have these wonderful labor savings devices.
So on our last question today, what is coming up for you for the future? I know we've talked about coming back for KeplerCollege and the medical courses that we're looking to put together in the Horary later this year. So what else is going on for you right at this moment? And where can people find you?
Right at this moment, I am working with my publisher to hopefully come up with a second edition of one of my books. I'm not going to tell you which one.
Keep that under wraps.
I've got a list of 10 more books that I want to write. So I'm hopefully going to have some more time to put into that. I plan to keep teaching, and speaking to astrological groups as I can.
Wonderful, wonderful. And do you still have ongoing active websites, or where people follow? Are you active on social media too, and all those different platforms?
I have restricted my social media to Facebook just because I don't have any more time for it. Right. My website is lehman.com. You can see me, you'll be seeing me shortly on the Kepler website, starting this fall. If you're interested in the STA, that's sta.co, not sta.com, sta.co. And so I do teach a little bit of the horary there, but the course was developed by Deborah Holding, and I teach within it. The medical material is there, and then whatever groups find me, and I still do consulting, and I'm pleased to do it.
Wonderful. And is that Lehman astrology.com?
Yeah, Lehman.com.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Dr. Lehman. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and such a privilege for myself to hear your thoughts on many different topics. So again, thank you for joining our Leaders in Astrology episode today.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.